So the thing that really interests me about Shakespeare's sonnets is when and why he started writing them. Shakespeare basically started writing sonnets because he went into the Elizabethan version of lockdown or quarantine. The plague kept ravishing London, indeed the whole of the UK, indeed the whole of Europe. And he would have put on different plays, like in the Rose Theatre, in the Globe, in different taverns, and then he would have had to shut down very soon after only just a handful of performances. I think Titus and Andronicus, not one of his best plays, a melodrama, very bloody melodrama, hilarious in its bloodthirstiness. It kind of predates Quentin Tarantino's aesthetic. He would have put that on 3 times, maybe at a tavern, maybe at the Rose, and then the government and also all of the theatre operators, everyone basically would have boarded up and they would have said, the plague is getting too much, people dropping dead in the streets, we can't obviously have people cramming into theatres at this time. So it's just interesting to think back all that time, now that we are in lockdown, now that we're quarantining, now that we're so concerned about public health safety, everything's shutting down. And so Shakespeare would have gone into quarantine several times across his lifetime. 1606 in particular was a really fascinating year, the year of Lear, as James Shapiro says, because he would have gone into lockdown, he would have gone into quarantine. And during that time, he wrote 4 of the greatest high tragedies a human being, a writer across any cultural time, across any language has ever written. And one of those being King Lear. But perhaps the first time, I think one of the first times he went into prolonged lockdown, he would have only had a handful of plays under his belt in performance. That would have been the Henry cycle, the tetralogy, that's the 3 Henry VI's, which people are kind of, they don't know whether they were written out of order, like maybe number 2 and 3 was done first and then George Lucas style, he did a sort of prequel, or if he just wrote them in sequence, that's what I believe. And then he would have wrote Richard III, which actually is when Shakespeare starts to get really good. He would have wrote Comedy of Errors. He would have wrote Titus Andronicus, perhaps. And then he went into quarantine, went into lockdown. What can you do? Are you writing plays when you don't see that the theatres will open again anytime soon? Of course not. So what does he do? He writes a long narrative poem called Venus and Adonis. And hot on the heels of Venus and Adonis, he writes The Rape of Lucrece. Both are tremendous poems, one heavier than the other. You can probably guess which one's heavier than the other. He's working from Ovid and other source materials. Basically, he would have done a speedy read of Ovid's tales and then just thrown the book away and just let his imagination work upon it, and he would have summed up his own story, his own version. They're both worth reading. But the sonnets were written, I believe, over a 2-decade-long period, and I think they would have started or would have kicked off during quarantine or during lockdown, during plague time. So around 1593, maybe all the way up to 1598, around that time. And then he starts writing to his fair maiden, his dark love. Some people, some gossipy academics think that there's evidence of Shakespeare's bisexuality, perhaps his homosexuality. Perhaps he was writing to a young man. People are divided on who that young man might be. Was it one of his patrons who actually gave him money and enabled Shakespeare to write these poems? I don't know. I think that's irrelevant because the sonnets themselves, no, I can't find any other sequence in human history, in writing, though there are some that are quite as resonant as the sonnets. The sonnets are like Beethoven's symphonies. They display supreme mastery. They also display a sort of chronology or a sort of narrative arc and a progression. So I believe Shakespeare would have wrote them in order, deliberately, and he would have wrote them for publication. I don't believe, though I might be wrong, that it was published during his lifetime, or if it was near the end of his lifetime, and then it would have been republished and republished. Shakespeare was perhaps a frustrated poet. People are divided on this as well. Some people think that Shakespeare experimented with poetry, but he couldn't make a paying job out of it. There was more money in the theatre, so he reluctantly went into the theatre, and you can see his frustrated poet coming out in the theatre. I think this is incorrect. I think maybe, okay, money was part of it, but I think he liked being a dramatist. Otherwise, I don't think he would have had the output that he did have. Anyway, this is all a roundabout way to get to one of my favourite sonnets. If you read the sonnets, there's 2 ways to read the sonnets. You can read them one by one and over and over and over again, relishing them, digesting them, trying to possess them by memory. The best way to possess a poem, to make it yours, to continuously drink from its life wisdom, is to have it memorized. Now, obviously, I don't like rote memorization when it comes to education. I think the Socratic method of education is the best one. But there is a place for memorization, because if you memorize something and you have it in your memory, you can always take it with you, and you can mull it over and you can digest it, and you can keep it across the course of your lifetime, no matter what happens. So what you can do is you can read the same sonnet over and over again, or you can read them in sequence. You can gobble them up, but when you come to a sonnet that makes you pause and take a breath, then you reread it and reread it and reread it. And one of the first sonnets that did that for me, I believe, is number 29. I think I like number 27. If we're reading in order from number 1, I liked number 20, 18, 12, but they get better in my opinion as they go on. But I liked number 29. And the thing I like about it is the fact that you can endlessly find new sustenance in sonnet 29. Now, obviously, the first few times I read it, which would have been over a decade ago now, I've probably read this hundreds of times. I would have been attracted to, obviously, the opening is quite resonant. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, this men's eyes on the ending would have caught my attention, would have been quite a resonant, strong image. I all alone beweep my outcast state. I like beweep. I like the melopea, as Ezra Pound might call it, the melody. And this is what I really liked. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. Firstly, I like the metaphorical language. This idea of a cry being bootless, a bootless cry, is quite arresting. I like the assonance in deaf heaven. I like the fact that he's troubling deaf heaven. He's not petitioning deaf heaven. Heaven's obviously not listening to him. God's not listening to him, not at this moment. He's troubling it, but heaven is not listening. Obviously, I would have been caught up in that line specifically, line number 3. But it's when I reread this now, perhaps a decade or so after I first read Sonnet 29, I like line 4, and look upon myself. Now, this is quite an innocuous line. Most readers would probably glide over it for the first 100 or 200 times that they read this poem. It's only recently that I've caught it and thought, look upon myself. And this is what's so great about the sonnets, because a lot of people, Jorge Luis Borges, to name one, said that Shakespeare was everyone and no one at the same time. He's no one in his plays. The characters are not mouthpieces for Shakespeare's ideas. They are their own conceptions. They change. And before Shakespeare, maybe we can make an exception for Chaucer, but before Shakespeare, characters didn't change. They weren't psychologically complex. They were just mouthpieces in morality tales. But in the sonnets, people think that Shakespeare's being more personal. He's not. He's not, even when he's most disgraced or depressed or betrayed in love, he doesn't get himself personally caught up in it. He still creates an artistic distance. He's almost like a god, overlooking his own state. So this idea of looking upon myself is really interesting. And then another thing that I picked up on recently is line 6, featured like him with friends possessed. And there's just something so evocative about that caesura, that little pause, and that repetition, like him. And I think that says it all, like him. It's almost like a mantra or sort of a hypnotic nightmare that you're caught in. And obviously, desiring this man's art and that man's scope. And then you get to happily, which is the volta. That's Italian for turn. Every sonnet has it. It's around the sort of 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th line where you outline a state and then everything changes. Boom. And it's usually signified by a word like yet or but, however, although, but this one is peculiar because it's happily. Now, happily means perhaps, but it does have a tinge to mean happiness or with happiness. Happily I think on thee. And notice that pause, mid-line. Everything changes. He's all alone, heaven's not listening to him, he's weeping, he's railing his fate, he's jealous of other men, he's jealous of people's supreme skill in art, he's jealous of people's riches and their hope. And he says, haply I think on thee. And up until this point, I think the sonnets have been a bit piss-takey, a bit jokey, kind of like pointing out a lover's flaws, his lover's flaws, like the wrinkled brow or the furrows, time's furrows, and pointing out their age and basically saying, well, you're getting old, so your beauty's going to fade, so you have to have a kid with me, so your beauty lives on. I don't think women generally find that romantic or persuasive. Like if a guy's trying to get a lady into bed, I don't think that's the right tact, is to go, well, your looks are fading, love, you might as well hop in the sack with me. But this one, actually for a moment, there's some resonance and there's some genuine humanity there. Haply I think on thee. And that says it all, that pause there. Everything changes after that line, haply I think on thee. And the line is not even over yet. And I think that's so eminently romantic. There's no wordplay, there's no duping, there's no double meaning, there's no over flowery, romantic, stereotypical, courtly language. It's just saying it how it is and leaving so much out. Haply I think on thee. And that's it. That's all it takes. And I think that's more romantic than all the 28 sonnets that have preceded this one. And then my state. And what's interesting is this wordplay with state, because he then goes on to contrast with kings, but he's talking about his mental state or his mood, simply that. And then my state, and then there's another pause, where he does introduce some lovely flowery language, like to the lark at break of day, arising, and then you're treated to from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate. That's what his state is doing. For thy sweet love remembered, and here comes the tinge of melancholy, for thy sweet love remembered. Is he just summoning up a memory of his love, or is it remembered because it is no longer accessible to him? What's happened to love? Are they gone? Are they dead? Have they scorned him? So there's a tinge of melancholy there, but we don't get access to the whole story. And then he says, and then I scorn to change my state with kings. So all this terrible fate of mine is irrelevant because I summon up simply your thoughts, and I wouldn't change my life for the world because I've met you. That's why I like Sonnet 29. It's endlessly readable. I suggest you try and possess it by memory. Every line has an inevitability about it, as Harold Bloom would say, where you wouldn't change a single word. You couldn't. Every word is perfectly placed. The syntax is perfect. The imagery is perfect. Beautiful. This is one of those poems that you cannot exhaust across the span of your lifetime, and it will always take on new meaning. And that's why Sonnet 29 by Shakespeare is my favourite sonnet. Let me know your favourite sonnet in the comments below. Thanks for watching. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. Haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.